So I've been learning a lot about myself recently. I've been taking a number of leadership assessments to try to figure out the kind of leader God has wired me to be. For example, I've learned that I am what they call a collaborator. I'm somebody a leader who leads not by saying, hey, this is the way it has to be, but by trying to get as much input from others as possible before moving forward with a decision. But what I've also learned is that each leadership skill set has both its strengths and what they call blind spots. Now, being a collaborator sounds like a really good thing. Somebody that wants input from folks, that's a good thing. But one of the blind spots for a collaborator is involving others to the point of unnecessary complexity, or trying to get that much input from so many people. I think what it's saying is that in an effort to include as many people as possible, it's easy to get bogged down and harder to move forward with some kind of decision. Now, if I'm honest, I think that one reason why I might be a collaborator or somebody who values input is that deep down, I'm also a people pleaser, or I can easily concern myself with pleasing people or trying to please people. I came across a joke where somebody said, "All right, I'm done trying to please people, as long as y'all are okay with that." People pleasing might seem like a pretty harmless thing, but it can lead to some problems. Not just organizational problems within the organization, or in our case, a church, but it can also lead to personal health, and mental and physical. That there can be some health risks. It can lead to poor personal habits and routines, greater stress and anxiety as you take on too much. It can even lead to resentment toward friends and loved ones who have learned over the years that they can exploit us. But what concerns us most today is the number one reason why so many of us are people pleasers, which is not because we are always so concerned about pleasing other people, but because we worry so much about what others think of us. When we have such a hard time saying no because we are worried about people seeing us as lazy or selfish or weak or uncaring or incapable. The truth is, people pleasing is deeply rooted in our fear of rejection and failure. We see it in Herod. I hope you read the passage for today. It's Mark chapter 6, beginning there at verse 14. Herod's pledge to this daughter, his pledge to give this daughter half of a kingdom that is not even his to grant, is an arrogant boast, as one person describes it, an arrogant boast meant to impress those in attendance at his party. He cares what others think about him, so he wants to please them. But what to do? He's at odds with his wife about John the Baptist, but he's at odds with John about his wife. On the one hand, Herod knew John to be a righteous and holy man, someone he preferred to keep alive for his own sake, because deep down he actually feared John and his following. But on the other hand, he has now made this outlandish claim, or this outlandish oath, to this dancing girl. You see, he wants to appear like a generous and trustworthy leader among Galilean society, but he also wants to appear strong and powerful and honorable among those in attendance at his party. So even Herod is learning here that you can't please everybody, because ultimately a choice has to be made. And unfortunately, Herod chooses to please the whims of a dancing girl so he doesn't look weak or inept in front of his peers. He chooses to make his own public image more important than even the life of another man, in this case, an innocent man, thereby exposing himself as a man with no control over himself or his words or his power or his household or his nation. He caves to the social pressure and proves that he doesn't have the moral courage to stand up for what is right or to do what is right. Referring to people pleasing in her book, Disease to Please, one psychologist writes, "People often say yes when they'd rather say no, setting off a whole host of emotional problems. For them, the uncontrollable need for the elusive approval of others is like an addiction. Their debilitating fears force them to use niceness and people-pleasing as self-defense camouflage." Reminds me of an interesting experiment where groups of 10 people were asked to come into a room for a test. Each group was told to raise their hand when the instructor pointed to the longest line on the chart, and there were 3 charts. But one person in the group, and this is where the experiment part comes in, one person in the group did not know that 9 of the others, so everybody else in the room, had already been told beforehand to vote for the second longest line on the chart. So the experiment would begin with the 9 voting for the second longest line. Then the 10th person would, typically glance around, look confused. How are these people voting for the second longest? Am I seeing things? And then after a while, just sort of slip his hand up with the rest of the group. The next chart would be raised, instructions repeated, and time after time, that self-conscious 10th person would sit there saying that a short line is longer than a longer line simply because this person lacked the moral courage or lacked the courage to challenge the group. This conformity, they called it, occurred in about 75% of the cases and was true for people of all ages. So it's a human thing, this human thing where we are concerned about what other humans think of us. The 10th person here in the experiment, just did not want the other 9 in the room to think that he was crazy or unintelligent or something negative, even though he didn't want them to think that he was wrong or unintelligent. And so that the irony here is that by going along with the group, he turned out to be wrong. Paul to the Galatians said, "Am I trying to please man? If I were still trying to please man, I would not be a servant of Christ." And he wrote to the Thessalonians, "But just as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, so we speak, not to please man, but to please God who tests our hearts." And then to the Colossians, "Obey in everything, not by way of eye service as people pleasers, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord. Whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men." You see, rather than fearing the Lord, Herod feared people. Rather than worrying about what God thought about him, he was worried about what other people thought about him. And so, rather than trying to please God, he pleases this random dancing girl and her mom by killing a man he knew was righteous and holy. This wouldn't be the only time either when a powerful leader would make a similar decision. Pilate, like Herod, would have otherwise preferred to leave the innocent Jesus alive, but pleasing the crowd with some magnanimous gesture, even if it meant carrying out the hostility of a third party, was more important. Both Herod and Pilate were driven by human praise, human notoriety, human admiration, approval. And it doesn't stop at tyrannical leaders either, does it? Even the disciples were concerned with the human honor and praise that would come with riding Jesus' coattails all the way into Jerusalem. Now, how have we given more thought about what others think of us rather than God? What decisions have we made based on social pressure or public image rather than on what we knew in our heart to be right? How have you been more concerned with pleasing people rather than God? One person once said, if you seek first to please God and are satisfied with that, you have but one to please instead of multitudes. And a multitude of masters are harder to please than one. Herod did not understand that. Pilate didn't understand it either, and at times we need a reminder ourselves. Just like those leadership assessments have reminded me of my own need for pleasing people. But John the Baptist didn't seem to crave human praise or admiration. Wasn't it John who said that he must decrease so that Christ might increase? Unfortunately, John lost his head, but you know what he didn't lose? He didn't lose his integrity. He didn't lose his courage. He didn't lose his voice. In fact, his witness has inspired Christians throughout the ages. You might have heard of Athanasius. He was an early bishop of Alexandria who fiercely opposed the teachings of Arius, who declared that Christ was not the eternal Son of God, but a subordinate being. Harassed through 5 exiles, Athanasius was finally summoned before Emperor Theodosius, who demanded he stop opposing Arius. The emperor scolded him and asked this question, "Do you not realize that all the world is against you?" That's when Athanasius quickly answered, "Then I am against the whole world." Who are you going to please? Who are you going to please? Amen.